tutorial number, this is tutorial number 14, and we're going to be covering loops and looping through arrays is the bigger picture here. Now, as I continue to mention, I won't belabor the point, but Big Toe Interactive's 5 pillars of Actionscript: variables, functions, event listeners, arrays, and loops. The final one. And the reason I'm doing these two back to back, the last tutorial was arrays, this is loops, is because one of the best ways to combine all this information that I'm giving you is by looping through arrays and just using loops and arrays together. Um, there are actually 3 types of loops. We're just going to focus on this one that I tend to use 95% of the time, which is the for loop. There's also the while loop, and I forget the name of the other one, but it's just basically ensures that the loop runs once and then it reverts to the same loop. So, but we're focusing right now on the for loop. You can look up the other two. I find them a lot less useful personally, so for games at least. So let's get right to it. So what I've done is I've just added 2 additional weapons into the tutorial here, just to get to 5. So this rifle here has the arm attached to it, but just ignore that. Just ignore the person that's had their arm cut off. So you got a rifle, and the other new one is this Wolverine type claws here. So and plus our original 3, the lance, the crossbow, and the sword. So it brings our total to 5. I've exported them out. Is the settings as the same name as the library name. They have an export just to show you properties. Export for Actionscript. Cat claws is the class name. So that's a class that I've created myself. Its base class is a movie clip, so it inherits all the properties of a movie clip, meaning it's basically a movie clip with extra functionality if you wanted to. So, but we're not going to get into that yet. So I've created the variables here, my global variables, claws. I've called these Wolverine claws, or claws, and that rifle I showed you is just called rifle. So I've gone ahead and added them into the array. Since you've already seen that, I don't want to go into that again. Our array now has all 5 weapons. The last index of the array is 4. Remember, we're starting with 0. Arrays all start with index 0, 0 through 4. So, what we're doing in our last tutorial is we're just adding this lance to the screen. We're putting it in an array, and we're adding it to the screen by calling its array index, which is technically this. As you can see from our load array function, weapons index 1 is lance. So I could say add child weapons 1. There it is, just like it was before. So, but I want to show you the brute force wrong method to do this, to get to the point of why it's important to loop through arrays. So I'm just going to go ahead and bear with me for 30 seconds here, whatever, while I add this in here. Put that at 300, sword, and we're just gonna, so I've got my 5 weapons here. Gotta change the name, crossbow, not a crossbox, it's a crossbow. Crossbow, put that at 450 or something like that. Now let's put our claws. This we're going to put underneath, so it's not on top of. And last is the rifle. Okay, so instead of one, I'm adding 5 things to the screen. Oh, whoops. I typo somewhere. Land. Oh, 2 swords. There we go. So I've added all 5 weapons to the screen here. So, but I've done that with, you know, well, actually 15 lines of code because I like to put spaces in between my statements. So this is just a brute force way. It's not the way to do it. And keep in mind, a real game has a lot more than 5 items in it. Not only do you have weapons and enemies, the hero, and all the parts he's probably made of, you've got your background, your bullets if it's a shooting game, power ups, score system. You've got all these different things on the screen to keep track of. So you just can't do things this way. You're going to have a million times more glitches than you should, and also your game could run slower. So the proper way to do this, here's where we get into what this tutorial is about: loops. I just had to show you first the wrong way to do it so you know what I'm talking about. So we're creating a new function here called add weapons. And what this is going to do is this is where we're going to, instead of adding everything to the screen manually, we're going to loop through the weapons array, which has, as you can see, is storing our 5 weapons variables, our 5 weapons objects that we've created in our document class. They're all stored in this array. So instead of manually talking to each one individually, let's just loop through the array, just flip through it like a book, and add each one. It's a lot better. So we're going to create a new variable inside of our function. This is a local variable as opposed to a global variable, which are not contained in functions. This local, it's contained within the function, so it's local, meaning I can only reference it within this function because that's where it's created. This is a concept called scope. I won't get into that more, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory. A class has scope and a function has scope. The class's scope is the full class. Like these are available to the full class. Anything made within a function, like our new variable here, is scoped within that function. I hope that makes sense. So we're creating a new integer variable called w, and w, I'm going to explain this in a second. W, while it's less than weapons dot length, which I mentioned in the last tutorial, is a property of the array class. It's a property that stores how many objects are in an array. Plus plus. So there's our loop. Before I fill anything into the loop, I'll go over this real quick. And we're creating a local variable called w, and we're data typing it. We're typing it as an integer, and we're setting it to 0, just like you've seen me do all the time. It's an integer, it's equal to 0. At the start, it's equal to 0. And so that's the first part of our for loop. These loops have 3 parts, you could say. It's a variable, creating a variable that you're going to increment either down or up throughout the loop. We're going to be going up starting at 0. So it's a variable integer equals 0. The second part of the loop is the conditions for when the loop should run until, or when it should stop. It's basically instructions on, okay, go until this point and then stop when you hit this point, this condition that I'm setting up. Which my condition here is when x is while W, while W is less than the length of the weapons array. W less than weapons dot length, which once again is 5. There's 5 things in there. This is equal to 5. It's the same as writing this, but you don't want to do that. That's not good practice to put an exact number, because when something changes, you're still enforcing a number that might not be correct. So with this, we're actually referencing the live, the current the current length of this array, because you can take things in, put things in, and you can take things out of arrays. So you don't want to hard code things into your loops. So this is the second part of the loop. Once again, it's a condition that says run this loop, do this piece of code that goes here. We haven't written yet. Do this until you hit this condition, which would mean until, or while, while this is true, run this piece of code. I was confusing the other type of loop, I'm sorry. While this condition is true, run the code. If the condition is not true, don't run it. It's almost like an if statement that says, if this, run this code. So if this is true, which it starts at 0, so 0 is less than 5, right? Increment it. So after it's run, we increment our variable, which means we're adding to it. So plus plus, which means it'll equal to 1. Just to show you what's happening here, I'm going to trace the value of W, of our W variable, which you're going to see it go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or 4, excuse me. So as you can see up here, each time this loop is run, and it's run very quickly, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This loop was run 5 times. And you're not seeing a 5 here, keep in mind, because 5 would not be less than 5. Weapon's length is 5. 5 was equal to 5. So if I put an equal sign here, you'll see a 5. There it is. So we're going to take that away, because that will actually give us an error, because there is no index position 5 in the weapons array. Remember, because we're starting at 0. So this is our loop. And what we're going to do with this, you'll see right now. So weapons W X equals W times 100 plus W times 1. Let's try that. I'm going to have to mess around with this positioning here. And then add child weapons W. Okay, so everything's up there. Oh, I forgot to set the Y position, of course. Let's just set that at the center of the screen. Once again, you multiply it by times 5. It's the same as dividing in half. I gotta tweak this again. Everything's piled on top of itself there. Weapons WX is equal to 100 plus W times duh. I want to multiply by more. I'll explain this in a second. Just get this set up so you can see my point. We'll go with 150. Give it more space. Okay. So we've done this. Instead of that 15 lines of code, we've done the same thing, and we've even organized it in a perfect line like this. the center points of these objects are not exact, so they actually are in a perfect line code-wise. They're just, this one's a little lower because its x point is somewhere higher. So anyway, we've done the same thing with, what is this, 5 lines of code or so. 6 if you count this. So 15 lines for 6. And that's, keep in mind, that's only with 5 objects. And that's also only one set of objects. You're looking at hundreds of lines of code versus, 10, 20 lines of code in your game. You could have 1,000 lines of code taken down to 100 lines by doing this method. And code, as it grows and grows, it becomes enormously difficult to find problems. So keep that in mind. So what's going on here? What we've done here, let's take it line by line. So keep in mind that our loop, W is equal to 0 this first time it's run. So this is the same as saying weapon 0, which is referring to the sword, right? Because W is equal to 0 the first time the loop is run. Remember, the loop runs 5 times in this case because the length of the array is 5. So weapon 0, aka the sword, x is equal to 100 plus W, again, which is 0 right now, times 150. So 0 times 150 is actually 0. So this is saying set the sword's x position to 100, because you can, this is canceled out. Set the sword's x position to 100. Set the sword, still 0, because we're still inside this first loop. Sword y this is always going to be the same. Set the sword's y to the middle of the screen. Stage height divided by 2 times 0.5 divided by 2, same thing. Then add child, weapon 0. So keep in mind, this first time the loop is run, we're just referring to this sword here. And then the loop runs again. Now, I'll keep this up actually so you can see what's going on here. The loop runs, so the loop finishes and it runs again. And now, because the third part of our loop is incrementing our variable, bringing it up or bringing it down. In this case, we're bringing it up, plus plus. The second time the loop runs, it's equal to 1. W is equal to 1 now, because we've incremented it. So weapons 1 equal, which is the lance, right here. Notice how its x position is higher. It's more to the right. X position is higher. So we've got weapons 1 x equals 100 plus 1 times 150. So it's 100 plus 150, 250. That's the 250 spot. And the y position is the same because we're always setting it to the middle of the screen in the y coordinate, the middle, so that would be right here. Again, plus plus. Okay, we're done. Add. W is now equal to 2, the crossbow, and etc. I'm sorry if this is like annoyingly slow, but I'm really trying to hammer home what's going on here because this is something that I struggled with when I started. So I'm trying to explain as literally as possible and as human language as possible how a for loop, and all loops function the same way for the most part. They just have varying conditions of when to end and when to start. But for now, let's just focus on the for loop because it really is the most important of the 3. So once again, we're creating a local variable. We're setting it to 0 at the start. We're checking our condition here. While, this is saying while W is less than the length of the weapons array, our loop is able to run. If it's no longer, then we break out of the loop. in this case, it'll run 5 times because while it's less than 5, because this is 5. Each time it runs, so it starts as 0, keep in mind, and each time it runs, at the end, we add to it. W++. It's the same thing as saying, this is not the proper way to do it, but it's the same thing once again as saying W plus equals 1. Or W equals W plus 1. So the proper way to do it is the way I had it here. And we've done this, and let's do something cooler. We're at 20 minutes now in the tutorial. It's going extra slow today. I'm sorry about that. But this is just really important. So we've added them to the screen. Let's do something cooler now. So after our add weapons function has already run, let's add our enter frame event listener to our game. It's right in the list here. Pull it down. I'll call the function main loop. And reference one of my other tutorials if you don't know what this is here, but it's an enter frame event listener, which is called once a frame. In our case, I think our movie's set to 30 frames a second. So every 30 times a second, this is going to be called event. It's of type event because it takes an event object as its parameter. It won't work if I throw this here. I'll get an error message. You can see it up here. It's going over and over. It's saying what this error means. I should explain this real quick. Is argument count mismatch on main loop. Expected 0 and got 1. So what this is saying is, now this main loop function is being called 30 times a second, which is why this function is actually written over and over and over. If I scroll up, you'll see. I'm going to stop the movie because it's just going to keep going. But what this is saying is, it was expecting 0 arguments to be passed to it, and it got 1. Now, what's being passed to it? This event object. It's an event object, and it's an enter frame of type, which is a property of the event class. It's actually a string. So it's passing this event object in, yet our function wasn't expecting it because we're not telling it here that we're going to be passing something in. And this event listener, this enter frame, requires that. So you have to pass it in. So I'm saying, okay, I'm passing in an event object into this. And you can use that event object for a bunch of things. I think I showed you in our keyboard tutorial, keyboard control, how to use that event that's passed in. So anyway, we're not actually going to be referencing this event specifically, but we do need to tell the function that it's going to be coming in. So let's do this. I'm just going to copy our loop structure here to save some time since this tutorial is already running longer than I wanted. We're going to delete this positioning code out, positioning and adding to the screen code, because we don't need that again, obviously. But what we're going to do is, since everything's already on the screen, why not do something cool and move the objects on the screen? So let's say weapons W, again, which is going to increment. So it's going to loop through them all. Weapons W Y plus equals 2. So we'll add 2 to the Y position every frame, which is going to make it move down. So let's see what this does. There you go. This is an idea. I mean, you could apply this to a bunch of enemies you want to move down. Imagine Space Invaders. There you go. There's enemies that move down at a set speed, and then you could hit detect if any of those enemies touched the main character, or if any of the bullets touch the main character, etc., etc. So, what if we want to do something cooler than that? Than just, instead of them all just moving like that in sync, what if we want to do something more funky? Like, let's see. Instead of a default, let's move the position based on the W, based on the value of that. What does that do? Look at that. So what's happening there? Why are they moving at all different speeds? Well, if you notice, which one is moving? Actually, I'm sorry, it's not moving at all. The first one, and why is that? Because W is equal to 0. So why should it move? Here, we're adding 0 to the Y value, but the other objects move faster because we're adding 1. Whenever we're referring to that object, W is equal to 1 in the case of the lance. In the crossbow, it's equal to 2. In the claws, it's equal to 3, and 4 for the rifle. So we're adding more and more every frame. So you get this. Or what if we did the opposite? Minus equals. There you go. And you can do a lot of things like that. Minus equals W, or let's see. Here, how about this? Minus W. I don't even know what this is going to do. Okay, look at that. Now this one is equal to 0. So you can see the possibilities. These are just weapons, but you fill in the blank with enemies or some sort of characters, and you start to get some ideas for games. It's simple, but it has value. And where this really comes in handy is in hit testing. And I'm going to show you why. I don't know if it's going to be the next tutorial or a couple down the road, but I'm going to show you why as we start to mesh things together and get a little bit bigger in what we're doing, closer to something that you would call a game, as small as it may be. You could call it a really stupid game that you probably wouldn't want to play for very long. But so that's it. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm going to throw in my pitch here. Check out Urban Santa in the App Store. If you're interested in supporting these tutorials, there's a link in the YouTube description page to download it. It's only $1 if you choose to support these tutorials. Thanks very much for watching. Please spread the word and subscribe. Thanks.